The Seeds of Rebellion, 1765. In 1765, life in the American colonies seemed peaceful. Thomas Hutchinson, a fifth-generation Bostonian, enjoyed success as both Chief Justice and Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts. The king had appointed him to these positions, and for years he had been one of the colony's most respected citizens. However, his life was about to change dramatically. An angry mob was forming in Boston. Hutchinson was about to discover that he was the man responsible for enforcing new British tax policies that had sparked violent rebellion among the colonists. These were taxes imposed not by their own local representatives, but by Parliament 3,000 miles away in England. The Stamp Act crisis. Across the Atlantic, King George III was losing patience with his American subjects. After spending £60 million defending the colonies during the 7 Years' War against French settlers and their Indian allies, Britain was nearly bankrupt. Parliament's solution was unprecedented. The Stamp Act of 1765, which directly taxed the colonies by requiring them to buy stamps for virtually every piece of paper they used, from official documents to playing cards. The colonists resented both paying the tax and having it imposed by a distant parliament where no one represented them. Over 150 years of colonial life had created something like a nation within the British Empire, complete with free assemblies, independent newspapers, and their own tax systems. The emotional issue was clear: who controlled their lives and their money? A secret organization called the Sons of Liberty formed to resist the tax. They used intimidation tactics against loyalists, including tar and feathering, which involved stripping victims naked, coating them with hot tar, and covering them with feathers. This humiliating punishment effectively silenced opposition to the Patriot cause. Educated colonists like John Adams used logic and law to fight the Stamp Act. Adams argued that no free man should be subject to any tax to which he has not given his own consent. His wife Abigail was his trusted partner and advisor, bringing her own passionate ideas about liberty to their cause. In Virginia, young Patrick Henry challenged British authority with his famous declaration, "No taxation without representation." His Virginia resolves became a rallying cry for all the colonies. Meanwhile, in London, Benjamin Franklin served as America's unofficial ambassador. At 59, he was the most famous American in the world, known for his scientific experiments with electricity and his popular Poor Richard's Almanac. Franklin tried to find a compromise between Britain and the colonies, but the business community ultimately forced Parliament's hand. When American merchants boycotted British goods, English merchants and bankers pressured Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act in March 1766, rising tensions and the Boston Massacre. The Stamp Act's repeal was a victory for the colonists, but Britain still needed money and wanted to show who was in charge. Over the next 4 years, Parliament tried various new taxes, each triggering fresh protests and eventual repeal. The exception was a tax on tea, which Parliament kept to assert its authority. By 1768, Britain had sent 4 military regiments to occupied Boston. The presence of 1,000 British soldiers in a city of 15,000 created a dangerous situation. On March 5, 1770, tensions exploded when local patriots began heckling British guards at the customs house. A crowd gathered, throwing snowballs, ice, and rocks at the soldiers. In the chaos, someone fired a shot, and British soldiers began shooting. When the smoke cleared, 5 civilians lay dead, including Crispus Attucks, a black sailor who became the first martyr of the American Revolution. Patriot propagandists immediately labeled the incident the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere created an engraving that showed British soldiers firing in formation on command, which was not what actually happened, but this version spread throughout the colonies and inflamed anti-British sentiment. Surprisingly, John Adams agreed to defend the British soldiers in court, believing that everyone deserved a fair trial. He won acquittals for 7 soldiers and light sentences for 2 others. His commitment to justice, despite his patriot beliefs, actually strengthened his reputation rather than destroying it. The Boston Tea Party and Intolerable Acts. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, maintaining a 3-penny tax on tea. Though small, this tax still represented British authority without colonial consent. On December 16, 1773, about 50 men disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians and dumped 342 crates of tea worth 10,000 British pounds into Boston Harbor. This act of defiance became known as the Boston Tea Party. The British response was swift and harsh. They passed what colonists called the Intolerable Acts, which revoked Massachusetts' charter, dissolved its assemblies, and sent 3,000 troops to reoccupy Boston. The Crown now directly controlled Massachusetts. Around this time, Benjamin Franklin's role in leaking private letters written by Governor Thomas Hutchinson was discovered. These letters revealed Hutchinson's true loyalist sympathies and his belief that colonial liberties needed to be restricted. In January 1774, Franklin was publicly humiliated before the King's Council in London. This experience transformed Franklin from a man seeking compromise into a committed revolutionary. The First Continental Congress. By summer 1774, the other colonies feared they would face the same fate as Massachusetts. In August, delegates from 12 colonies met secretly in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Key figures included John Adams and John Hancock from Massachusetts, George Washington from Virginia, and Patrick Henry, who declared, "I am no longer a Virginian. I am now an American." After 2 months of debate, Congress agreed to hold all trade with Britain until colonial rights were restored and instructed local militias to arm themselves and prepare for conflict. The shot heard round the world. In April 1775, British General Thomas Gage received orders to seize a rebel ammunition supply in Concord, Massachusetts. On April 18, 800 British soldiers began marching from Boston. Patriot messengers, including Paul Revere, spread the alarm throughout the countryside. At dawn on April 19, about 130 militiamen gathered on Lexington Green to confront the British. In the tense standoff that followed, someone fired a shot, and both sides began shooting. 8 militiamen died in what became the first battle of the American Revolution. The British continued to Concord, where they faced growing numbers of colonial militia. Forced to retreat to Boston, they endured constant attacks along the 16-mile route. By day's end, 73 British soldiers were dead, with 174 wounded and 26 missing. Colonial losses were 49 killed, 40 wounded, and 5 missing. Building an army. News of Lexington and Concord brought the Second Continental Congress back to Philadelphia in emergency session. They faced the enormous task of creating a continental army from various colonial militias. John Adams nominated George Washington of Virginia as commander-in-chief, believing that a Southern leader would help unify the colonies. Washington, at 43, was one of America's wealthiest men with extensive military experience from the French and Indian War. Though he claimed to be unworthy of the position, his ambition was clear. He had attended every congressional session wearing his military uniform. When Washington arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he found not an army but a disorganized collection of undisciplined militia. The men were dirty, drunk on duty, and knew little about military procedures. Washington had to teach even basic military functions like filling out reports and maintaining hygiene. Bunker Hill and early battles. On June 17, 1775, British and American forces fought their first major battle at Breed's Hill, incorrectly called the Battle of Bunker Hill. Though the British eventually won, they paid a terrible price. Nearly half of their 2,300 soldiers were killed or wounded, compared to 271 American casualties out of 1,600. This costly victory taught British commanders that defeating the Americans would not be easy. As one general wrote, "The success is too dearly bought." The battle gave Americans confidence that they could inflict serious damage on the world's best army. The question of independence. Throughout 1775, Congress still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. They sent the Olive Branch Petition to King George, requesting autonomy within the British Empire. However, in October, the king rejected the petition and called for decisive military action to end the rebellion. In January 1776, a pamphlet called Common Sense by Thomas Paine changed everything. Paine, a recent immigrant from England, wrote in plain language that everyone could understand. He argued that America had the power to begin the world over again, and that the cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind. Common Sense became a bestseller, selling 100,000 copies. It gave colonists a vocabulary for revolution and made independence seem not only possible but inevitable. The Declaration of Independence. By June 1776, the idea of independence had taken hold. Congress appointed Thomas Jefferson to write a declaration explaining why the colonies were breaking from Britain. Jefferson, a 33-year-old Virginia lawyer, locked himself in a Philadelphia boarding house and produced one of history's most important documents. Jefferson's draft declared that all men are created equal and have unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, this created contradictions, especially regarding slavery. Jefferson owned over 100 slaves, and many other colonial leaders were also slaveholders. Congress debated Jefferson's draft for 3 days, making 89 changes and removing all language criticizing slavery. The final Declaration of Independence was approved on July 4, 1776. The delegates knew they had committed treason, punishable by death. As Benjamin Franklin supposedly said, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." The British response. King George responded to the declaration with overwhelming force. Britain assembled the largest overseas military expedition in its history. 130 warships and nearly 25,000 soldiers, including German mercenaries called Hessians. This massive force arrived in New York Harbor in summer 1776, creating a terrifying spectacle. Washington knew he faced an impossible task: defending New York's many islands and miles of shoreline against the world's most powerful navy with no naval force of his own. The Battle for New York. The British attack began on Long Island in August 1776. Using superior numbers and tactics, they devastated Washington's forces. American losses were heavy: 300 dead and 1,000 captured. Washington managed a miraculous nighttime evacuation across the East River, saving his army from complete destruction. However, the defeats continued. The British captured Fort Washington in November, taking another 3,000 American prisoners. Washington's reputation plummeted as his army retreated across New Jersey. Many soldiers deserted, and even some of his own generals began plotting against him. General Charles Lee, an experienced British-trained officer, secretly worked to undermine Washington's leadership. However, Lee's ambitions ended abruptly in December when British cavalry captured him while he was staying at a tavern in his nightclothes. The crisis winter. By December 1776, the revolution seemed nearly dead. Washington's army had shrunk to about 5,000 men, most of whose enlistments would expire on December 31. The British controlled most of New Jersey, and many colonists were switching sides to support the king. Thomas Paine, who had joined Washington's army as a correspondent, wrote another pamphlet called American Crisis. It began with the famous words, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. Washington's gamble. Crossing the Delaware, Washington knew he needed a dramatic victory to save the Revolution. He planned a desperate attack on Trenton, where Hessian soldiers were spending Christmas. On the night of December 25, 1776, Washington led his army across the ice-filled Delaware River in a blizzard. The crossing was treacherous, taking most of the night. 2 soldiers froze to death, and many others suffered frostbite. When dawn broke, Washington considered turning back, but decided to push on at all events. Victory at Trenton. The attack on Trenton was a complete surprise. The Hessians, recovering from Christmas celebrations, scrambled to defend themselves but were overwhelmed. In less than an hour, Washington's forces killed or captured 1,000 Hessians out of 1,500, while suffering minimal casualties themselves. The victory electrified America. After months of defeat, Washington had shown that the Continental Army could still fight and win. The success also solved Washington's immediate crisis. When he asked soldiers to extend their enlistments for an extra $10, enough men agreed to keep the army together. Conclusion: a revolution reborn. The year 1776 had been a test of American resolve. The colonies had declared independence, suffered devastating defeats, and nearly lost their revolution. But Washington's victory at Trenton proved that the cause was not lost. The British had missed their best chance to end the war quickly. Washington had learned valuable lessons about fighting a guerrilla-style campaign against a superior enemy. Most importantly, the Continental Army survived. And as one observer noted, the Army is the Revolution. As 1776 ended, both sides prepared for a longer, bloodier conflict. The Americans had gained something precious: hope. The Revolution would continue, though the hardest battles still lay ahead. The dream of independence, nearly extinguished in the dark days of December, flickered back to life with the sound of church bells celebrating Washington's victory. The year had transformed 13 separate colonies into the beginnings of a nation, tested their resolve in the fires of war, and produced the ideas and leadership that would eventually win American independence. Though the outcome remained uncertain, the foundation of the United States of America had been laid in the momentous year of 1776.